What I thought we would talk about today is that in this benighted world of ours, we are now in an election year, the United States of America. An election year means a lot of people fulminating about things that don't matter to the daily lives of anybody anywhere on the planet. Which is, as for example, one set of American politics, it's the entertainment division of the military industrial complex. So, with that in mind, one of the topics we're going to be hearing more and more about, I suspect, from the rightmost end of the spectrum is the phrase cultural Marxism. We've already seen the word Marxist thrown around a lot, usually with the word cultural attached to it. Democrats, of course, are terrified to be called Marxists or socialists or leftists. But it occurs to me that very few people in this country of any political persuasion know that cultural Marxism is actually a real thing, number one, and number two, that it has nothing to do with what people in the political sphere think it is, either if they throw the term around or cower in fear of being accused of being one. Nobody knows what a cultural Marxist is. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about cultural Marxism, what it is, where it came from, uh, and what it really means today. So, how's that?
Sounds good to me. Let me start, and let me be provocative a little bit by telling you how I first encountered the American rendition of what cultural Marxism is. I had a long time earlier encountered the phrase when studying the history of Marxism. And that history went, and this is a little schematic, but it went roughly like this: that Marx was a political economist, that Marx was interested in a critique, above all, of Smith and Ricardo's economics, celebratory of capitalism. Marx's was different, it was critical of capitalism. And if he had secondary interests, they lay in the areas we would nowadays call politics or history or the combination. And that's what Marxism was about. And that Marxism wasn't about a lot of other things that were probably quite important, but that Marx didn't get to in his life beyond casual commentaries, asides, and matters of his own personal interest. And so, in that framework, I was then introduced to great Marxists who, in the 20th century, had responded to what I just said by taking Marxism into the areas of culture, of ways people have of believing things, theorizing things, understanding the arts, understanding those things of life that are not economic or political, more narrowly defined. And in that vein, I was introduced, I remember sequentially, to some of the people who later came to be known as the Austro-Marxists, that first group of very creative Marxists at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century in Vienna. The contemporaries and the personal friends, in many cases, of people like Sigmund Freud or Richard Strauss, or many other of the thinkers, particularly of the 20th century. Then I was told Marxism in the 20th century became more and more persuaded that the culture had been underrepresented in Marxist scholarship, in Marxist thinking, and that cultural matters could be as powerful explanatory variables as anything else, as economics or politics or history. And I was given the Hungarian philosopher, Georg Lukács, the Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School of Thinkers, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer. And basically, I was told this incredibly rich mine of Marxist work was what cultural Marxism had to offer. And I wasn't the only one who was taught this. Probably the most famous cultural Marxist called that in his lifetime was a West Indian scholar based in Britain named Stuart Hall. And he developed a whole movement, a sizable group of young people that studied with him as they went through the university, and began to branch out and do studies of cultural phenomena. If you say culture is our systems of belief, and what is meaningful, and that what culture does is create and disseminate meanings of things, well, then that's just as important a strand within which history evolves as anything else, including economics. Okay, with that having said that, when I then encountered cultural Marxism in the United States, and I would say I started hearing that in the 1980s, maybe the 1990s, it had absolutely nothing to do with Lukács, Gramsci, Stuart Hall, or anyone else. It was a completely different idea whose central initiation was around the word multiculturalism. And it referred to a movement in American academic life, which, if you were going to be crude, said that intellectual life in the United States is dominated by the books and articles of old white men, and that they had a lock on it all, that the professors were old white men, the authors were old white men, the ideas were those of old white men, and that this was stultifying and narrow, and there ought to be a self-conscious, explicit opening to a multicultural intellectual life of the United States. Black people, female people, brown people should be able to have their novels, their paintings, their poetry, whatever it might be, factored in. And a kind of quote unquote culture war began to unfold. And at first, it was ridiculed. The old white men were not about to go without a fight. And it became a struggle over who would get hired as a professor of something in a department. And the universities, caught up in multiculturalism coming at them from other parts of the society, decided that they would side increasingly with those faculty who championed the welcoming of voices that had been excluded, and not listen to the voices of the old white men who still dominated the bureaucracy of the American university, but from a defensive position. This produced, and people should be aware of this produced unspeakably ugly, nasty struggles in many colleges and universities in which genuinely younger female and non-white professors nudged old white men out of positions of authority. And as they hit back, the old white men associated multiculturalism with something they hoped would dissuade the young people, namely by linking it to Marxism. And they did that mostly by saying in the same breath, this university is imperiled by Marxists and multiculturalism. Then it became Marxist multiculturalism, and then it became cultural Marxism. But it is really the unholy alliance of Marxism and colonialism that you were fighting against. Last point. In recent speeches, Donald Trump, who will, I assume, now be the Republican candidate for president, says how he's going to get rid of, and I quote, vermin. And the vermin, he lists them: Marxists, socialists, leftists, half a dozen other phrases, by which he means, because he sometimes says it, people who are described by these words as words in a synonym dictionary. They're all the same. There is no need to distinguish among them. They are all the same. And that allows you to put into the same category everybody who questions the dominance of old white male academia has now become beautifully associated with what the last 75 years taught Americans is the most hateful political posture imaginable, Marxism. And so you can collapse the two together. You talk about Marxist culturalism. You act as if you knew what it was. You act as if you knew that the different ways these words have been used are either irrelevant or utterly unknown to you. And you can go out and declaim against the partnership of Marxism and let me leave it there.
Sure. And a couple thoughts. One is, sure, it's obviously much easier to say we're fighting Marxism than to say I selfishly want to keep positions of power for my friends and myself and do not want to see underrepresented people finally get, a portion of representation in academia or somewhere else. But if we break down the phrase, and you did a great job of it, but if we break down the phrase cultural Marxism, it's doing heavy lifting here, right? Because first of all, you have to define, if you're going to do it right, which they don't, the word cultural and the word Marxism. And in leftist thought, in Marxist thought, cultural, I think, went from being neglected to maybe in the early 20th century, first years of the So a Russian Revolution, they talked about cultural, workers and the arts and so on, and journalism as expressions of what was essentially still a economic or political ideal. Then you had the cultural Marxists, the real cultural Marxists, who I think you know a lot more about than I do, but who really applied. And I want to go back into it a little bit more, new ways of looking at the thought as culture and culture as thought. And then you have these guys who aren't really using culture in a proper sense of the word means, but cultural in the sense of, ethnicities, demographics. And that's what they mean by, that's why they use the word cultural associated with the word Marxist. So, I mean, I guess there have been multiple reactions to this on the left, but one of the things that strikes me, it may not have been the original intent behind using the phrase as an epithet, but it strikes me that part of what's happened in this war against multiculturalism and against cultural Marxism is that one of the reactions on the left side of the spectrum, broadly speaking, right? I mean, including the cultural left, right? The left when it comes to identity, to lifestyle, to orientation, to ethnicity, is that it has been used on the leftward side, but not the, socialist or economic left side of the spectrum. But for example, among Democrats of a certain ilk, as a way to try to cleave or separate the principles of social justice from economic justice. And that it's been, I mean, some people, Adolph Reed Jr., for example, writes about this a lot, talks about this a lot, but to me, I've seen it myself. I saw it when I was working for Bernie Sanders in 2016, that somehow it's also being employed not just by Donald Trump and his ilk, but by certain, they're called centrists. I don't know if they represent the center of American political opinion, but by certain liberal centrists or neoliberals to say, if you want to talk about worker rights, if you want to talk about economic equality, economic justice, guaranteed health care for all, guaranteed retirement security for all, good education for all, that somehow it's been manipulated in certain occasions as a betrayal of what Trump would call cultural Marxism. Oh, that must mean you're betraying, the cause of feminism or civil rights for Black and brown people or what have you, or LGBTQ. We could go on and on. Whereas the true left, historically, has always been the strongest voice for these social issues as well, and the earliest voice. So do you get what I'm driving at? And do you agree that perhaps this cultural Marxist framing, even if the expression is not used, is also being used by the sort of more centrist neoliberals to alienate well-intentioned people from economic justice?
Absolutely, and it's quintessential American politics. Look, if I were blunt, I would say this is the way white supremacy cleans up its act. We're not white supremacists. We're against cultural Marxism. Okay, turns out that cultural Marxism will substitute quite nicely, thank you, for getting rid of anybody who is dissenting from the dominance of old white males. And it means, yes, there'll be an old white male here or there sneaks in who's a Marxist of some kind. Why not? But in general, it allows you to get rid of what it is that's actually bothering you at a very deep level, which, look, the slogan, you will not replace us, that's where it comes from. Those people in Carolinas, they march to the song, you will not replace us. What they mean is black and brown and female will not replace the dominant male white part of the population that has controlled things in the United States and that feels that Donald Trump is their last best hope, at least for the moment. And they need something that they can rally people around, and directly saying what it is they want is still a bit of a taboo in this culture. That can be very dangerous. That can backfire on you. And so they want these euphemisms, and these euphemisms work well for them. And they can invent a cultural Marxism. You know, their ignorance is painful to watch, funny sometimes because they're so lost in it, but they have no use for distinguishing their understanding from others. Reminds me of the time that J. Edgar Hoover got angry at the American Communist Party because they used the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois had decided to join the Communist Party toward the end of his life, to say that the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs of America were being infiltrated by these communists who should know better than to infiltrate something as American as the Boys Club.
Well, I agree with everything you said, but I'm speaking about something a little different. I'm speaking about, let me give you a quote as an example of what I'm speaking about on the Democratic side. When I talk about trying to separate the issues of social justice from economic justice. Here is Hillary Clinton speaking in 2016 during her primary campaign against my old boss, Hillary. And this is a quote from Hillary Clinton, quote, "If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, would that end racism? Would that end sexism?" End quote. "No," the crowd yells out. Quote, "Not everything is about an economic theory, right?" Clinton said. I guess my point in bringing that up is that to me, the flip side, other side of the coin to the Trumpism is this attitude. Of course, not everything's about an economic theory, but actually it would do enormous things to ease the pain of racism and sexism if we broke up the big banks. The big banks are using their power to discriminate against black people, against women, you know, when they want more mortgages, when they need a loan for a car. We could go on and on. Economic inequality is much tougher on black households, women-led households, and so on. It's an integrated whole. So that's what I mean when I talk about kind of the liberal side of the cultural Marxist epithet. The idea of a cultural Marxism as an epithet. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Absolutely. Listen, I'm a child. I was a child at the time. I remember hearing in my household when the Emergency Civil Liberties Union broke away from the American Civil Liberties Union. That was the issue then. It was the issue of the people who had a socialist consciousness woven into their advocacy for fair trial or for a more balanced media or whatever it was. And the people who fought against them were the liberals, with the support of the conservatives. And the liberals needed to have a way of showing that you could be in favor of these progressive things without sharing the scary economics of it. So yeah, that is an old truism of American politics.
And yet people have argued against it. The people that, the country just, this nation just did its annual lionization of a sort of cardboard cutout of Martin Luther King Jr., who said, you know, what good is it to integrate a lunch counter if a black person can't afford a hamburger at the lunch counter? So this is not a new, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture said, you know, everybody may see the injustice when a police officer beats up a black man, but they don't see the racial injustice when the sheriff evicts a black family from their home. So to me, this is not a new idea, but I think it's been given a new twist as cultural Marxism becomes an epithet. But you know, before we go, I guess I would want to bring up the real cultural Marxism again. What are a couple? I must admit, I don't. I've read some of those works. I found them fascinating, but I'm not sure I can summarize it as as distinctly as I can, you know, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. It strikes me, you know, as touches on the sort of equality of ideas and perspectives and getting away from hegemonic views of the world and so on. But is there a way to nail down the concept in one's head and start exploring it?
I think so. And I think it comes out of the history of Marxism. In the 20th century, particularly in the first half of it, Marxists around the world were confronted with a staggering new reality. They had organized political parties, they had organized labor unions, they had organized um, successful electoral campaigns, and they had organized successful revolutions, not just in Russia in 1917, but to remind folks that there was a revolution that set up a Soviet government in Bavaria, based in Munich, another one in Hungary, based in Budapest, and there were others as well. And all of them, I'm going to exaggerate now, but all of them failed, with the exception of the Soviet Union. And within a short time, the Soviet Union was known as Stalin's Soviet Union, by which people meant something different from what they associated with Lenin. And those were the only two leaders the Soviet Union had in its first 20, 30 years. So what was the problem? Marxists said we have to answer that question. We clearly had a good bead on the economics. Look how well we did. We had a pretty good bead on political economy. Look how well we did. Well, then what happened? Why did the revolutions not succeed except in Russia and except in the peculiar form of Stalinism later on? And it was as important to explain the Stalinist deviation, if you like, as it was to explain the failures of the rest of the world to follow suit. That's what Gramsci, Lukács, and a whole host of others, that's what they went to work to try to figure out. And the answer they came to, in a nutshell, is that Marxists had traditionally failed to respect adequately the power of systems of meaning, that the production and distribution of what life means is as powerful a shaper of historical events as anything else. So Gramsci, arrested by Mussolini as he becomes the fascist leader after 1922 in Italy, he arrests Gramsci, at that time the head of the Italian Communist Party, and puts him into jail for the rest of his life. In jail, Antonio Gramsci maintains notebooks about a whole raft of issues, but most of those issues turn out to be analyses of the power of ideological construction on the history of the working class. Because, for example, he spends an enormous amount of time on the ideas, the detailed breakdown analytically of the ideas of the Italian Roman Catholic Church, because it shaped the thinking of Italian Catholic working class people. And he showed the power. You know, if you take over the guns and you take over the ships and you take over the tanks and you take over the headquarters and the telephone exchange, if you don't have the right subjective attitude, if you don't have ways of thinking and meaning in people's mind, they will voluntarily undo the revolution that's now within their grasp. You know, this was the passion. Lukács, the same thing. In the most famous of his writings, History and Class Consciousness, what he tries to show is that there really is such a thing as common sense, ways of making sense of the world that have been inculcated in the mass of people, the working class, for centuries. You better attend to those. You better counteract those with an alternative set of commonsensical ideas. Because if you don't, the preservation of the old ideas in the new context will produce a conflict whose outcome is unknowable in advance. But if you want examples of where the old consciousness undid or negated the new economic reality, then for many of these writers, the Soviet Union was understood in that light. And they understood, the United States as perhaps the par excellence example that the United States, for other reasons, was very intent on developing commonsensical ideas that were peculiarly designed to reinforce the capitalist status quo. And here it wasn't left to an inheritance from the feudal time, the Roman Catholic Church, the Protestant churches. No. This is much too important to leave to those institutions. We have to make those institutions work to our ends, or else they'll work for the ends of our political enemies. And that has been feminists in America took that up. They had a ready-made argument. Marx and Marxism hadn't addressed questions of gender, sexuality, and so on. And largely that was true, not quite as to the extent that it was said, but okay, I mean, things aren't exact. And, the people who wanted, Walter Rodney and the early Frantz Fanon and people like that had to say the same thing about race. Was not an issue central to Marx in the 19th century. It just wasn't. But it did become so later with movements of people. And I think it's worth rescuing both cultural Marxism and the right-wing slogans of the left, because both of them are crude oversimplifications of what cultural Marxism was or is.
And perhaps good examples of what a genuinely cultural Marxist approach might be able to address and heal. It's really important work, whatever label you call it. And I would go so far as to say it's a point as a perspective, as a kind of mission statement. I think it informs a lot of what I do, a lot of what you do, and a lot of what these conversations that you and I do, which is to try.
So
So, so as always, I thank you for all those conversations and for this one as well. Richard Wolff, thank you for coming on the program.
my pleasure. And as I think about it, maybe we ought to gather all those conversations and do something with them just to preserve an artifact of cultural Marxism.
I'm all for that. Let's plan on that.